Movie ratings are supposed to protect parents and guide audiences, but sometimes the MPAA completely dropped the ball. How else do you explain movies filled with gore, terror, and nightmare fuel slipping through with a soft little PG slapped on the poster? These weren't harmless family outings. They were childhood traumas waiting to happen. Which of these so-called PG films do you think scarred the most kids for life? Stick around, because some of these choices will shock you. Jaws, 1975. How did the granddaddy of summer blockbusters manage to escape with just a PG rating? Steven Spielberg's Jaws may have been marketed as a thrilling adventure, but audiences quickly discovered they were in for something far darker. The opening attack alone, featuring a young woman pulled underwater by an unseen force, was enough to haunt viewers for decades. By the time dismembered limbs floated across the screen and a bloody shark attack left swimmers scrambling, parents realized this wasn't a lighthearted sea story. At the time, the PG-13 rating didn't exist, so films were shoved into either PG or R. The studio knew that stamping an R on Jaws would gut its box office potential, so despite sequences of severed arms sinking to the ocean floor, close-ups of mangled bodies, and the sheer terror of a massive shark lurking just beneath the surface, the MPAA went soft. Audiences walked out both thrilled and shaken. Kids begged their parents never to go to the beach again, and the film sparked a very real wave of shark fear. Yet somehow it wasn't considered harsh enough for an R. Looking back, it feels like a clear case of Hollywood putting profit over appropriate classification. If Jaws was submitted today, it's hard to imagine it walking away without at least a PG-13, if not an R for intensity alone. The real question is, how many nightmares were created by that one little PG stamp? Poltergeist, 1982. A haunted house story produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Tobe Hooper doesn't exactly scream kid-friendly. But in 1982, Poltergeist somehow walked away with a PG rating, and that single decision terrified an entire generation. Families rented it thinking they were in for some spooky fun, only to find themselves glued to scenes of corpses rising from pools and faces peeling off in graphic detail. The story follows a suburban family tormented by vengeful spirits who literally kidnap their young daughter through a television set. That alone is enough to rattle nerves. But Hooper and Spielberg didn't hold back on visual scares. Chairs stacked ominously in kitchens, ghostly hands reaching out of the TV, and horrific skeletons bursting onto screen. It's all intense, yet stamped safe for kids. The truth? It had originally been given an R before MGM appealed the ruling. The decision boiled down to marketing. An R rating would have killed its reach, so the studio fought for a PG despite sequences that many horror films today would never get away with. The result was a blockbuster hit and thousands of children traumatized by what was supposed to be a family ghost story. To this day, Poltergeist is held up as one of the most glaring missteps in MPAA history. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, 1984. By the time audiences settled into the second Indiana Jones adventure, they thought they were in for more whip-cracking fun. Instead, Temple of Doom unleashed scenes so intense that parents were left fuming, and the MPAA scrambling to adjust its entire system. Heart extractions, children enslaved in underground mines, and a man being lowered into molten lava while screaming in agony were all part of the PG adventure. The fallout was immediate. Parents flooded theaters with complaints, outraged that something so dark had been deemed appropriate for children. To the MPAA, the movie wasn't graphic enough for an R, but clearly too extreme for a regular PG. This left them with an awkward gap. The solution? They invented an entirely new category, PG-13. Spielberg himself admitted later that the movie probably went too far, but it also changed Hollywood forever. Every studio now had a middle ground for films that weren't adult-only but definitely not for kids. Temple of Doom became the spark that forced the MPAA to grow up and refine its standards. Still, it's wild to think that until the outrage hit, kids were technically cleared to watch a man's heart ripped from his chest while it still beat in his hand. How was that ever PG? Gremlins, 1984. If you were a parent in the mid-80s, Gremlins probably tricked you. The poster showed a cute fuzzy creature. The trailer teased a Christmas comedy, and the PG rating suggested family fun. What audiences got instead was a horror comedy packed with violent creature attacks, exploding gremlins and microwaves, and enough nightmare fuel to make kids cry for weeks. Director Joe Dante leaned hard into dark humor, showing the once cuddly Mogwai multiplying into an army of scaly gremlins who delighted in wreaking havoc. One infamous kitchen scene sees gremlins stabbed, chopped, and blended into goo. It's played with comic exaggeration, but the visuals were gruesome by any standard, especially for PG. Parents were furious. Just like Temple of Doom, the backlash against Gremlins was so strong that it became one of the driving forces behind the new PG-13 rating. Looking back, it's easy to see why. Kids expecting a family comedy about a magical pet instead got decapitated creatures and holiday mayhem that veered closer to horror than heartwarming. Yet the controversy only fueled its cult status. Gremlins thrived on the shock factor, and today it's remembered as both a holiday classic and one of the most notorious cases of MPAA misrating. It's proof that a PG label can sometimes mean prepare for gore. Beetlejuice, 1988. When Tim Burton's Beetlejuice hit theaters, the PG rating misled countless families into thinking they were in for a quirky ghost comedy. What they got was a surreal, twisted romp filled with dark humor, grotesque imagery, and a trickster ghost who gleefully broke every rule in the book. Michael Keaton's Beetlejuice isn't just mischievous, he's crude, chaotic, and often disturbing. The film features graphic transformations, gory makeup effects, and dialogue that pushes the boundaries of what PG was supposed to allow. Burton laced the film with bizarre sequences like shrunken heads, sandworms, and a dinner scene where guests are forced into a macabre dance. It was imaginative, yes, but hardly what parents expected when they saw the rating. The truth is, the PG-13 rating had only been around for a few years by 1988, and the MPAA was still figuring out where to draw the line. As a result, Beetlejuice squeaked through with a PG, even though its tone and content clearly skewed older. For many kids, it was a jarring introduction to Burton's unique style, and for parents, it was one more reminder that MPAA labels weren't always reliable. Today, Beetlejuice is beloved as a cult classic, but it also stands as one of the clearest examples of the MPAA being far too generous with its rating. One thing's certain, anyone who saw it young learned quickly that PG doesn't always mean safe. Watership Down, 1978. Imagine renting a charming-looking animated movie about rabbits, only to watch your kids burst into tears as those bunnies get mauled, slashed, and bleed out on screen. That's the reality of Watership Down, an adaptation of Richard Adams' novel that pushed the limits of animation and the patience of parents everywhere. Despite the subject matter, predators ripping apart rabbits, fights that end in torn throats, and endless images of death, it was slapped with a PG. To be fair, the book itself was never meant for small children. It's a dark allegory about survival, power, and leadership. But the animation format tricked audiences into assuming this was kid-friendly, much like a Disney cartoon. The MPAA didn't help by refusing to give it a stricter rating. The result? Parents traumatized, kids scarred, and a wave of complaints that echoed long after the movie left theaters. What makes Watership Down notorious is that it isn't just one shocking moment. It's relentless. The violence isn't stylized. It's raw, bloody, and deeply unsettling. Decades later, it's still considered one of the most disturbing animated films ever made, despite the fact that many first encountered it on Saturday afternoon TV screenings. The PG rating feels less like a mistake and more like negligence. If you ever doubted the MPAA's inconsistency, look no further than those poor animated rabbits. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, 1988. Cartoons and comedy might have made Who Framed Roger Rabbit look like a kid's movie, but the content was way edgier than its PG label suggested. Robert Zemeckis blended live action with animation in a groundbreaking way, but the story leaned heavily into darker tones. From mobsters dipping characters into barrels of acid, to a villain's horrifying transformation at the end, the violence was intense and surprisingly graphic. Christopher Lloyd's Judge Doom remains one of the scariest children's movie villains of all time. His bug-eyed reveal scene had kids covering their faces and adults questioning how the MPAA allowed this for general audiences. Add in constant innuendos, suggestive dialogue, and jokes that clearly weren't meant for younger viewers. And you have a movie straddling the line between adult comedy and family fare. Yet, the MPAA shrugged, gave it a PG, and sent it off to theaters as if nothing was out of place. Parents left, wondering why their kids were crying after a supposed cartoon comedy. The film became a critical and commercial success, but its rating remains one of the most baffling calls in MPAA history. With its mix of violence and dark humor, Roger Rabbit probably should have been PG-13 at minimum. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1996. Disney movies usually got away with a G or PG rating, but The Hunchback of Notre Dame stretched the limits of what parents expected from a so-called family cartoon. Adapted from Victor Hugo's grim novel, the film dove into mature territory. Gothic imagery, fire-filled hallucinations, and scenes of public humiliation made it one of the darkest animated features Disney ever produced. Yet, the MPAA gave it a G in some regions and only a soft PG in the US. The villain, Judge Frollo, isn't a typical cartoon bad guy. He's terrifying. His twisted obsession, his cruel treatment of Quasimodo, and his fiery downfall gave the film a haunting edge. Combine that with imagery of hellscapes and violent clashes, and you've got a movie that felt more like nightmare fuel than family entertainment. Parents were divided. Some praised the studio for tackling weighty themes, while others thought it was far too frightening for young audiences. What no one could believe was that it got away with a rating so lenient. Looking back, Hunchback stands as proof that animation isn't always kid-safe, and that the MPAA seemed to wave it through without really thinking. Spaceballs, 1987. Leave it to Mel Brooks to create a Star Wars parody so irreverent it shocked parents, yet somehow still only earned a PG. Spaceballs is beloved today for its clever gags and endless quotable lines, but the content is a whole other story. From crude humor to strong language, it's filled with moments that were well beyond what most parents expected from a PG comedy in the late 1980s. The infamous "We ain't found Sir" line is still jaw-dropping to hear in a supposedly family-approved movie. Add in suggestive jokes, edgy slapstick, and sequences that push boundaries, and you've got a comedy that clearly should have landed in PG-13 territory. But in 1987, the MPAA seemed to be in a forgiving mood, stamping it PG and sending kids off to repeat lines they absolutely shouldn't have been quoting on the playground. The film's cult status owes as much to its daring humor as to its sci-fi parody, but it's still one of the clearest examples of a misrating. Today, no one would blink at giving Spaceballs a PG-13. Back then, parents had to just deal with the fact that PG didn't mean safe anymore. The Dark Crystal, 1982. Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal looked like a fantasy adventure with puppets, so parents assumed it was fine for kids. But what unfolded was one of the darkest, most unsettling fantasy films of the 1980s. The PG rating didn't prepare anyone for grotesque creatures, eerie atmospheres, and frightening sequences that bordered on horror. The Skeksis alone were nightmare fuel, ghoulish bird-like creatures that drained life essence from captives in scenes that felt more like torture than adventure. Add in battles, death rituals, and an oppressive tone throughout, and you had a movie that unsettled children everywhere. Parents left theaters stunned that this had been considered appropriate under a PG. Critics admired its ambition, but for kids, The Dark Crystal was less magical escape and more psychological trauma. It has since gained cult status among fantasy fans, but its misrating is still talked about decades later. If the MPAA's job was to protect children from material too dark for them, they failed spectacularly here. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. On the surface, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory looked like a sweet musical with candy-coated fun. But beneath the bright colors was one of the strangest, most unsettling PG-rated films ever made. Parents expected a harmless story about golden tickets and chocolate rivers. Instead, they got one of the most bizarre sequences in movie history: the infamous boat ride. The scene feels like pure nightmare fuel. Psychedelic colors flash across the screen as Willy Wonka, played by Gene Wilder, recites a disturbing monologue about violence and chaos. Kids in the theater squirmed, while parents wondered why this was allowed under PG. And that's not even mentioning the fact that one by one, each child meets a fate that's either terrifying, cruel, or downright sinister. Whether it was Augustus Gloop sucked up a pipe, Violet swelling into a blueberry, or Veruca Salt falling into the garbage chute, the imagery haunted plenty of viewers. While the film has since become a classic, many still argue its PG rating never warned parents about the unsettling and surreal tone. Instead of a sugary family fantasy, audiences were handed a cautionary tale filled with twisted visuals and bizarre energy. It's the kind of movie that lingers in your head long after the credits roll. Definitely not the harmless candy-colored musical, The Rating, suggested. Dragon Slayer, 1981. When Disney and Paramount teamed up for Dragon Slayer, parents assumed the PG rating meant this was another fun fantasy adventure. They were wrong. The film is gritty, violent, and at times shockingly brutal. Set in a medieval world terrorized by a dragon, it features scenes that are anything but family-friendly. The dragon Vermithrax isn't played for laughs or wonder, it's a terrifying creature that burns victims alive and rips through villages. Some of the most disturbing moments include charred corpses, fiery attacks, and implied sacrifices of young women to the beast. The tone is relentlessly grim, and the violence often feels too graphic for anything below PG-13. Yet, the MPAA insisted it was suitable for young audiences. Viewers left theaters shaken by how far the film went, especially considering the Disney name attached to it. Parents expecting a magical sword and sorcery adventure instead witnessed a fantasy horror film that leaned into despair and destruction. Dragon Slayer is now praised as a hidden gem of dark fantasy, but its rating remains baffling. This was no light fairy tale, it was a frightening plunge into fire and death. Return to Oz, 1985. Disney once again fooled families with Return to Oz, a film that carried a PG rating but traumatized kids across the globe. Marketed as a follow-up to the beloved Wizard of Oz, audiences expected whimsy and charm. What they got was electroshock therapy, decapitated heads in glass cases, and villains so terrifying they still show up in nightmares decades later. The film opens with young Dorothy being taken to a mental institution where she's strapped down and prepared for harsh treatment. Before long, she's thrown into a nightmarish version of Oz, filled with bizarre and terrifying creatures. The Wheelers, with their screeching laughter and wheels for hands and feet, scared kids senseless. Even more disturbing was Princess Mombi, who kept a collection of severed heads she swapped out at will. Parents felt betrayed. This wasn't the cheerful sing-along they remembered. It was closer to a psychological horror film. Yet the PG rating made it accessible to families with no warning about the terror inside. To this day, Return to Oz is remembered as one of the darkest children's films ever made, and its soft rating remains one of the MPAA's most glaring oversights. Ghostbusters, 1984. Ask anyone who grew up in the 80s and they'll tell you, Ghostbusters was marketed as a comedy blockbuster, but the PG rating didn't warn audiences about how creepy and edgy it could get. Sure, it had jokes and catchphrases, but it also delivered genuine scares and a surprising amount of suggestive humor. The terror dogs, the haunting scenes in the library, and the grotesque transformations were straight out of horror films. Kids sat frozen in theaters, both laughing and shaking in their seats. Add in plenty of cheeky dialogue that definitely wasn't meant for younger ears, and you've got a film straddling the line between family comedy and adult-oriented humor. The MPAA, perhaps charmed by its comedic tone, waved it through with a PG. Parents soon discovered that while their kids loved the proton packs and Slimer, the darker elements left lasting impressions. Today, Ghostbusters remains a beloved classic, but it's also proof that PG in the 1980s didn't mean what parents thought it did. Young Sherlock Holmes, 1985. Barry Levinson's Young Sherlock Holmes may sound like a safe adventure story, but under its PG rating lurked some of the most disturbing imagery of the decade. The plot follows teenage Sherlock and Watson investigating a sinister cult, but the real shock came from the hallucination sequences. Characters fall under a curse that makes them see horrifying visions, flying daggers, grotesque food turning into monsters, and corpses coming to life. These sequences were nightmarish, intense, and unforgettable. For many young viewers, they were also deeply traumatizing. Add to that the darker themes of ritual sacrifice and sinister conspiracies, and you've got a movie that feels far more like a horror thriller than a simple PG adventure. Critics admired its ambition, and it has since become a cult favorite. But the rating was an outright misfire. Parents expecting a charming detective tale for kids instead got frightening imagery that still pops up on scariest childhood moments lists today. If there was ever a film that deserved PG-13 before the rating had fully found its footing, it's young Sherlock Holmes. So there you have it, 15 movies where the MPAA dropped the ball and handed out PG ratings like candy, even when the content was anything but kid-friendly. From sharks and gremlins to dragons and ghosts, these films proved just how unreliable those little letters could be. Which of these misratings shocked you the most? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more wild movie deep dives, and remember, PG doesn't always mean safe.